Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I'm going to talk about giving the player the option to have the player characters flee from a combat. This is something that we had in the program before when it was a single combat between one player character and one monster. But we got rid of it and now we're adding it back for group combat. So here we have a combat which has just started and we have the initiative, and it's saying click on an enemy to have Bold Cypress Tree attack them or flee. Bold Cypress Tree is the first player character. So if we click to attack, then the round will proceed as normal, but if we choose to flee, we can see that the first enemy gets a hit, and in fact all of the enemies are going to have a go, and they've managed to kill two player characters and reduce the others. But after all 6 of them had a sort of free attack, because it was our initiative, and in fleeing we gave the initiative to them, then it says you flee the combat and the combat is over. And actually when they were striking at us, they got an advantage compared to how likely they would be to hit in normal combat, which we'll look at when we look at the code. So let's see how the code works. If you saw the last video, you might notice that there's a new page, flee, which is obviously relevant. It sets up the various variables. But let's start with initialize, which is where the actual program starts, and we'll go through all the changes that we needed to add to make fleeing possible. So the variable f, we actually kept that in. We have had that throughout the whole time, but it hasn't done anything. But now that we've added the option to flee, it does do something. The variable f is set to 1 if the player is fleeing. The other variable, and this one is new, is PT, which stands for player turn, and that is also set to 1 to indicate something. It's what we call a flag, meaning that it has a value of either 0 or 1. And 1 indicates that it is the start of the player character's turn, and therefore the computer knows that it has to give the option to the player character to run away, because the way that I've set this up, you can't attack with a couple of characters and then decide to run away. You have to decide at the beginning and forego all of your attacks for that turn. So why, you might ask, don't we just use, because we've got a variable which is CA, standing for current attacker, why do we need a separate PT variable? Can't we just say if CA equals 1? Well, we can't do that because player 1 might be dead, and the start of the player character's turn might be it might be character number 2's attack, or number 3, or even number 4 if the other 3 have all died. But it's not necessarily the start of the turn when it's player 2 or 3 or 4's attack, because if player 1's alive, well, that's the first one. So we can't refer to any particular value of CA and be sure that that's what the first character to attack, that's the value that first character attack is going to have. So we need to have a separate variable, and that's what PT is. So let's have a look at flee first, and then I'll go around the sort of main cycle, showing you what the changes are. So flee, sorry, one more thing before I do that. We have a little change here where if $AT equals 0, which means if the attacker is the player characters, then we set M to equal, you have the initiative, line break, click on an enemy to have name of the first character, attack them, and then we've added or flee, and we have a link to the page flee. And the other place, that's at the start of the combat if the player characters win initiative, and it will also happen at the start of each player character turn. So let's look at what flee does. Well, it sets $AT to 1 and $DE to 0. So in other words, the monsters are attacking and the player characters are defending. It sets F to 1, which is the flag that says this is the final round, the player characters are going to run away. Then we include find first attacker. Well, we've already discussed this code. It is the code that does what it says on the tin. It finds the number of the first attacker, in this case the first monster that's alive and therefore that has an attack. And then we go to the page enemy. On the page enemy, we'll sort of skip over those because there's no changes there. That's just where the computer decides who is the current monster that's attacking going to attack, because when the player is attacking, when the player characters are attacking, the player chooses which monster to attack by clicking on the relevant picture. But we have to have some code to let the computer side decide who they want to attack. Sometimes it's random. It depends on the strategy that the individual monster has. Then we have strike. Strike is the part where we work out whether the hit actually has hit, and if so, how much damage has it done. And it also has this code, which again was already here, but wasn't ever active, because it's if F is equal to 1, then set Y equals Y plus 4, and F was never equal to 1, but now we've added this code here in flee, which sets F to 1, so it might actually be relevant. So what it does, it sets Y equal to a random number from 1 to 20, plus the relevant attack bonus, and if F equals 1, it adds 4 to Y. Now, if F equals 1, then the monsters are always going to be the ones who are attacking. So there's no need to go. We could have had if F equals 1 and AT equals 1, but as it's set up at the moment, that's not necessary because the monsters will always be the attackers. So we add 4 to their attack roll if the other side is running away. I don't know how realistic that is, but in game terms, I think it's quite good because it means that if you run away, the combat that you're going to face is going to be more difficult, but it's going to end more quickly. You just have to get through one round of it, and you'll survive. But in that one round, you're more likely to be hit. So it creates the possibility of some, decision making. I won't go through. I mean, there's quite a lot of code here, but we've covered the rest of the page. And the next bit we need to look at is next attacker. What next attacker does is it adds 1 to the variable CA, and if the hit points of the character that it's sort of moved on to is less than 1, in other words, if it's moved on to a character who's dead, well then it goes back to the top of the page. Essentially, it includes itself. It includes its own page. So it'll skip past any dead characters, basically. And then there are various special cases, such as the one that's probably most relevant for our purposes. If $CA is over $E, in other words, $E is the number of enemies. So let's say there are 6 enemies, which there are in the current program, and CA gets to 7. Well, that tells us that all of the monsters have either had their attack or are dead. If $AT is equal to 1, in other words, if the monsters are attacking. So that would normally mean that we have to change the um, side over. In other words, let the player characters have an attack. So we set AT to 0, we set DE to 1, we include find first attacker, we add to the variable M this message. M is the text that's going to be displayed on the page display, by the way. We add to that the message, you have the initiative. So it'll say something like, enemy 6 strikes at such and such but misses, or strikes but at such and such and hits and does 2 damage. And then it says you have the initiative. And what we've added now is we set PT equal to 1, that variable that tells us that it's the beginning of the player character's turn. So that's one addition. And the other addition is, you notice that we've got if F equals 1, and then some code, and then else. And so the else is what sort of happens normally. But if F equals 1, in other words, if the player has chosen to flee, we set O equal to 1, O telling us that the combat is over or going to be over. And well, no, sorry, that the combat is over. Sorry, and then we add this message: you flee the combat. So it says enemy 6 strikes at such and such and hits for 5 damage, killing them, but you flee the combat. Of course, we have this victory check. So if the enemy had struck and killed the last player character, well, then we wouldn't get the message that they flee, because it would have detected that and it would go straight to display. It would skip next attacker. But assuming there's somebody alive, we get the message that they flee the combat. Now this PT, this new variable, when we're starting a new turn, this is when we get the option to flee, other than the possibility at the start of the turn, at the start of the program, if we start with the initiative. So let's go down to that. This is all what I'm skipping past here is to do with the morale check. Okay, so if $AT is equal to 0 and $O is equal to 0, in other words, if the player characters are attacking and the combat isn't over, then we get this message: click on an enemy to have whatever character is currently attacking attack them. And if PT equals 1, we set PT equal to 0 so that it doesn't trigger every time, it only triggers this once. And we add to M or flee. So in other words, it's the start of, in this particular code, if this particular code triggers, if PT is equal to 1, it's the start of the player character's turn. It's the first player character to have an attack. We can click on an enemy to have that character attack that enemy, or we can choose to run away. And then we add a full stop to the end of the message there. And then, of course, we go around, assuming that we haven't, we go around to display, and unless something has happened along the way that ends the combat, well, then the combat will continue again. So those are the main things we need to add. There's a couple of extra variables, or there's one extra variable and one that's been sort of useless thus far in when we initialize. There's a new page which sets up the end round if the player character does choose to flee. And then there's the bonus there, which may not be very realistic, but in game terms is quite good, I think. Of course, you might have no bonus to hit, but you might have a bonus to damage instead. Perhaps you'd say, well, they're hitting them in the back and they're sort of undefended, so therefore they should have some sort of greater damage. You could also have a more elaborate system where, in this system that I've got here, the armor class is just a number, but perhaps you have a more elaborate system where it's broken down and you say, well, this character gets 12 armor class from their armor, but then they get another 3 for their shield, and they get 4 for their ability to parry. And when they're running away, they'll get the value from their armor, but they won't get the shield value and they won't get the parrying value. And so therefore the bonus might be different for each character depending on the origins of their armor class, or their sort of if you're treating it as a sort of total defense value and breaking down where it comes from. But I have set up a very simple system where it's just a number and it doesn't say why they have that. Do they have that because they've got armor, or do they have that because they're sort of really good at parrying? Well, we don't know. Or do they have that because they've got a shield? It's just a number. But if you know, as usual, there's any number of ways you could make it more complicated. You might decide that it isn't very realistic to have any sort of bonus. But you know, I'm just doing what I do, usually basing it from what I've got from tabletop role-playing games and what I think sort of works well in game terms, really, more than anything else. The other thing I would like to say is that sorry, I was going around and writing all the changes, and also there's a couple of changes in this page related to that new variable PT. But the other thing I wanted to say is that you may have noticed that when the monsters flee, when they fail their morale check and flee, they don't suffer an extra round of being attacked. They just run away. Whereas the player characters do suffer an extra round of being attacked. And you could rationalise that in sort of in-game terms. You could say, well, you're in a dungeon and the people you're fighting are the inhabitants of the dungeon, and so they know the terrain, and so they can sort of retreat into the shadows in a way that you can't. But that's not why I did it. The reason I did it is just because if the monsters run away, you've basically won the combat. And it seemed to me that then having a full round of all of your characters having to choose who they attack, there wasn't much at stake there. You've already won. And so it seemed like that wouldn't be particularly fun. Whereas if you are running away, well, it does matter whether they hit you, of course, because if your characters die, that's fewer characters that you have for the next part of the adventure. And you might set up your game in such a way that it does matter. You might set up your game so that you only get experience points, for example, for actually killing monsters, and you don't get experience points if the monsters run away. And so therefore, whether you can kill them is really relevant. Or you might have a system where if they run away, they might come back later and attack you later, and so that would be relevant. Or you might have a system where treasure is very important, and if they run away, then the characters don't get any treasure. So there are various reasons why you might not do it the way that I've done it, where you might actually have that extra round. But I've decided to do the most basic simple system where it doesn't happen. So what I would like to do in future videos is I'm going to look at how we can have extra characteristics for both monsters and player characters, but and probably more for player characters. Extra options that might make combat more interesting. So I hope you'll tune in for that. I hope you found what I did today useful or interesting, and I hope I will see you next time.